and bodhicitta. O sanje chedan sogi chonam la chancho bardo dane chapsum je dage jin sogi besanam je dola penjer sanje drumbar sho sanje chedan sogi Chonam la chancho bardo dane japsum je dagi jinso gibe sanam je dola penjir sanje rombar sho sanje chedam soge chonam la chancho bardo Dane chapsum je dagi jinso gipe sunam je drola penjer sanje drobar sho zimjen tamje dewa tan dewe judan dembar jurje donga da donga ji juran rawa jurje Donga mebe dewa tamba tam indrawa jurchi Yirin chadani tan rawe Tanyam chembola nebal jurti. The Dharma expands balance of Akanishta is the essence of all Buddhas the three times. He shows me directly my mind is Dharmakaya. I prostrate to the glorious exalted gurus. Please bless me and all sentient beings that our minds become the Dharma. Please bless us that the Dharma become the path. Please bless us that the path dispel confusion. Please bless us that confusion arise as wisdom. And so now, first of all, please think to yourselves that we need to bring all of our mothers, all sentient beings throughout space to the state of completely perfect Buddhahood. And that one way to do this, and why our particular way for us to do it, is to engage in the activity of translation. And so think to yourselves that we are studying this activity, considering it for this purpose. And please listen with this motivation of bodhicitta. And have I frozen? Is the internet connection bad today? No, it's okay.
No, it seems okay. Not frozen.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's okay for you? Then okay, I'll assume it's just going to be okay. Okay. So let's see. So in the first week, we spoke about the importance of meditation, how everything follows from that. Last week, we spoke about the, what do we say? How the education, the areas that we need to study in order to become translators. And so this week, what I'd like to speak a little bit about is what we should look for in a translation and styles of translation and issues such as this. Now, for those of you who are just beginning Tibetan, actually, what do we say? Actually translating something right now it's probably more of an exercise at this point than actually doing it, because you have to build a bit of knowledge and experience. So it takes a while to get there. But I think that even at the beginning, when you're first starting out, if you have an idea of what you need to look for and what you need to think about, it'll maybe change the way you think about the texts as you read them, study them, as you translate. So that's what I would like to speak about today. Now, the first thing is that there are lots of different styles of translation. And in particular, in Buddhism, I think we've got two old examples of translation that are very different. One of that, which I mean, I don't know if any of you speak any Chinese. I can read 50 characters and that's about it. I can say polite things. So I don't speak Chinese really, and I can't read Buddhist texts in Chinese. But what people who do read them tell me is that the texts that were translated from Sanskrit into Chinese were translated in a very natural Chinese style. Now, that natural Chinese style was 4th century, 5th century natural Chinese. So it's no longer natural Chinese, which gives a lot of Chinese Buddhist students of this day difficulties because the language is old. But at the time that they did the translations in the first millennium, they used actual, real Chinese and tried to make the translations into idiomatic Chinese. So that's one approach to translation. The Tibetans took a different approach. And the Tibetans, they were actually kind of this was at the same time as they're developing a written language, and they're heavily influenced, of course, by the Panditas and their ideas about Sanskrit and Sanskrit grammar and so forth. And in a sense, when they made a Tibetan written language, they kind of imposed Sanskrit grammar on a Tibetan base, which they don't really correspond actually fundamentally, although there's some interesting ways of thinking about things. The Sanskrit idea of declension that then goes into Tibetan as the name in Tibetan, which actually really tells you how to use the tsikche and so forth. At any rate, this sort of grammatical ideas in Tibetan were being developed at the time that they began translating, or were newly developed. In other words, they invented the written language for the Dharma translations, and they had a great respect for the Sanskrit. So the myth is, or the standard thing that everyone says, I'm not sure that it's really a myth. They say that you can take the Tibetan and translate it directly back into the Sanskrit because everything in the Sanskrit was translated into the Tibetan. All right, so this is what we always say, or what everyone always says. They say, so the Tibetans are really faithful because they take everything in the Sanskrit and they put it into the Tibetan. So in this way, when you're looking, especially when you're looking at Tibetan translations, you find a lot of words with, prefixes or the Tibetan equivalences. They add extra words in the front to make it the equivalent of a Sanskrit prefix. You have tarpa, which would be moksha in Sanskrit. And then you have, for vimoksha, for that prefix vi, they add the namratarpa, and so on and so forth. So there are all these sort of Sanskrit has a lot of prefixes, like many Indo-European languages, because Sanskrit is an Indo-European language. Tibetan didn't have any, so they kind of made up a way to do it. And so the idea a lot of people have is that everything in the Tibetan, or everything in the Sanskrit, is represented in the Tibetan. And so therefore, everything is kind of a literal translation. Now, there are some of these literal translations where they do account for every bit of Sanskrit grammar that are just absolutely wonderful translations. For example, as a translator, what do we say? One of my heroes among the Tibetan translators is probably not the one. Everyone thinks of Verochana or someone, or Rinchen Sampo or someone like that. But the one who I always think about is Bande Kawapaltse. If you look at his translations, any of his translations, they're just incredibly clear, easy to understand. Yes, they have a lot of Sanskritized grammar, but they're easy to understand. Another one who is like that is Pangloder Tempa. He was a 13th century translator. He did some Tantric translations, but he also did a really fantastic translation of Janendra Buddhi's commentary on the work of Dignaga. So this is not something that everyone reads every day, but it's a really amazing trend. It's very clear, very easy to understand. And they've recently found the Sanskrit. You take a look at the Sanskrit, you look at the at the Pangloder Tempa's translation, and it's very, very good translation. So those are like the good examples of that style of translation. But there are a lot of examples of prayers in or of works that are translated into Tibetan where you don't have, or they don't show as much skill. And so the danger of this is that you get a translation sort of like the and you're going to think this is sacrilegious. Oops. And the sacrilege is, if you look at the translation of the 21 homages of Tara in Tibetan, and try to actually extract any meaning from it, as opposed to just reciting it with faith and devotion. If you try to figure out what does it mean, some of it's okay, kind of strange Tibetan. Some of it is like so inscrutable that if you look at the commentaries, and also because everyone has such devotion for Tara, no one wrote it, or very few commentaries on it. And the commentaries that they have, when they get to some of these inscrutable lines like Chatsel Kune Korab Gawe, what does this mean? No one knows. So they translate it as, they go off on these tangents. It's like about turning the wheel of Dharma and so forth. Now, these are, I'm not going to argue with the meaning of the translation, but in terms of the words, if you look at the Sanskrit, pramudita bada, it's like, wrapped up in joy. And you can kind of get that in the Tibetan, but you don't really. So it's an example of Tibetan that is very literal and doesn't communicate the meaning. And then there are translations that are even harder to understand than that. So the Tibetan translation style does have some, there are qualities to it, but there are dangers in it as well. So when we're going into our target language, so for me, it's English, for you all, it's Spanish or Portuguese or whatever. When you're going into your target language, you have to be aware of a couple of things. If we look at the example of the Tibetan and Chinese, the first thing that is clear is that by the time they started translating Buddhist texts into Chinese, they'd already had several hundred years of literary history. They had an established style. So and they had established vocabulary in all the style. And when the Buddhism was being translated into Tibetan, they were making up the language, they were making up the vocabulary. There were great debates over how do you translate the different words before they even settled on the standard terminology and then codified that. So there was a lot, the Tibetan was happening, the early translations especially were happening at a time when the literary language was first being developed. And so that, I think, also has an influence on the style of translation that they chose. They couldn't say, well, this is similar to this sort of Tibetan literary history, because before that, they hadn't really had a literary history. They'd had oral history, they'd had oral tradition, and probably a rich one. I haven't really researched it. I don't know what the Tibetan, but the pre-Buddhist Tibetan language was like. There are probably people who have, but I haven't, so I can't really say. I'm sure there was a rich history because that's how languages are, but they didn't have a rich literary history because they didn't have any writing. They didn't have that history. So when they translated Buddhism into Tibetan, they had to make it all up. And then it got kind of codified as, well, this is how you do it during the early translation period. And then people continued with a similar style in the later translation period, the Sarma. So that's kind of the historical situation. So we have to look at our own languages. And I think we're all talking about languages. I mean, Spanish and Portuguese, you've got hundreds of years of literature. English, you've got hundreds of years of literature. Chinese, you've got thousands of years of literature. You've got all of this literary history. So when we translate, we need to be, as I said last week, we need to be aware of that. So and then the other thing is that a lot of the issues that come up in Buddhism have actually already been dealt with in Western thought. And so there's a lot of language that already actually reflects this, that is in current use. Now, since I've been working so much on validity, tsema, pramana, I'll use an example from that. We have the idea of a chi, which is like in Western thought, it's called a universal, the idea that's sort of like a Platonic idea, like there's some sort of universal cowness, this thing of cowness that inhabits every instance of a cow. And so in English, this is called, in traditional English, this is called a universal. This is the term that people have been using since they started talking about this in English. And it goes back to probably the terms that St. Thomas Aquinas used in Latin in the 13th century. So I'm sure you'd have something similar in Spanish and Portuguese, right? So we have the word already. But when we look at Dharma translations, what do people say? Often they will say a generality. Now, if you're taking the Tibetan word chi and you're translating that back into English, that's actually a decent translation. And I think it kind of covers the meaning. But what happens is you're making any dialogue between the old ideas, the traditional ideas we have in English, or the English philosophical tradition, and the Eastern, the Indo-Tibetan philosophical tradition. You can't make the connection over this idea because you're using a different word. You speak to someone, they ask you, well, what is this generality? And they say, well, why are you just speaking about a universal, right? So this is kind of an example. And you guys probably aren't working on as arcane stuff as I have been keeping myself entertained with for years. So maybe it's not the best example to use with all of you, but it is a way. So you need to use words that reflect what we actually do in our own language. We have this tradition in our language. We also have, to bring it on a more contemporary idea in English, we've got the Tibetan word. I might have mentioned this one already. Did I say this yet? Stop me if I've already said this before, or maybe just don't stop me. I'll just say it. There's a Tibetan word, dodo, which literally means to attach a feather. It means that you take an idea and you kind of plaster it on something else. And people translate this into English in all sorts of different ways. They translate this as imposition. They translate it as superimposition. They translate it as ascribing. They translate it as exaggeration. It gets translated in all these different ways. Well, if you look at what we actually say in real English, when you speak to people, what do they call it in real English? We call it a projection. So if you have a word in your language that people already use, then you don't need to make up a special Dharma term that no one is going to understand, right? So we want to use words. I mean, this is just on the basic level of word choice. We want to use the words that people already know, whether it be words from the tradition, or whether it be words that people use. Now, here the caveat is that there are words that come from the Christian tradition that we have to be careful of using in Buddhism. And there are two reasons for that. The first reason is that the understanding of the words is a little bit different. I mean, an example of this, and one that I don't think prevents us from using the word, at least in English, is that the word faith means something very different in Christianity than it does in Buddhism. In Christianity, there's no proof, but you believe anyways. And in Buddhism, it's like you have confidence and therefore you feel faith. So it's not that there's a lack of proof. It's that you have faith because of the proof. So they're very different, fundamentally different. But there's some surface similarities. So we use the same word, and that one doesn't bother people. But you might think about the Tibetan word dikpa. And then you might think that, we could translate it as in English as sin, or the Sanskrit, is it the Spanish or Portuguese, whatever. And French would be pesh, wouldn't it? I don't remember. Anyways, you know what it is in your language. And if you use that word, then particularly if you're in a situation where your readers are all recovering Catholics, they're going to have a different kind of understanding of it, right? So you have to be careful. And a lot of people have an extremely negative reaction to it, in English especially. No one wants to hear anything about anything they possibly do, possibly not being good. If they want to do it, it must be good for most people. And so when you use a word such as sin that makes them think that it might not be, then they have problems with that. So that word is loaded. So you have to be very careful. I mean, you could also think of it, and I think some very early translations did. They thought of like the Trikaya in Sanskrit, the Kusum. You could think of it as being the Trinity. Well, you can't really say that in English. Some people try to make the comparison between the two, but you can't really. So you have to be careful when you're using existing words. Do they imply things that you don't mean? And particularly when it comes to Christianity. So that's kind of on the level of word choice. But we also have to look at it on the level of kind of syntax and grammar. So when you're actually working and trying to put something together, you can't really make up awkward new syntax. And often what happens is you have some idiosyncratic word choices, and that kind of puts you into using idiosyncratic grammar. That means that your sentences are kind of unwieldy in your language. So a rule of thumb is if you read the sentence and it doesn't make sense in ordinary Portuguese or Spanish, you have not actually understood the Tibetan. There's a step, you see, there's a point where you go through, you translate all of the words and you figure out the grammar and you put all the grammar of the words together. So you have this string of words that grammatically matches the Tibetan, but you haven't understood and you haven't put it into language that actually communicates the idea. So you can't be too attached to the grammar. So, for example, you can't say, "Oh, in the Tibetan there is the word ki, ki." Ki. So that is that's a name drukpa. That's jalda. So it's sort of like the word of or de la or whatever it is in Spanish and Portuguese. It's like that. So I must use that word of. Well, maybe not. Maybe you don't even use a possessive. Something is in the fifth case, it's got the nasa ne, or you have chir or something like that. And you think, oh, therefore I must use something that like a show from or whatever. But if you translate like that, you're going to be translating words and missing the meaning. So what's important is that your translations will be able to actually communicate the meaning. So you have to go through the grammar, go beyond the grammar. Now, there will be times, especially at the beginning or when you're doing a difficult passage, where you need to take it and go through and do it in kind of like a really grammatical translation first. Then once you've done that, you need to go back and think about what does it mean? And then you've got to rework it so that you're actually saying it in real language that people would speak or read or write or understand. Of course, there are different levels of language. So you've got to take the Tibetan and bring it into Spanish or Portuguese that people can understand. Because if your readers can't understand it, then they won't get any feeling. If they don't get any feeling, they won't feel faith. They won't receive the blessings. They won't be inspired to practice the Dharma. So this goes back to the motivation. If the motivation is to help people, then you have to make translations that people can get feeling from. So you've got to speak not just to the head, not just to the eyes, but you have to be able to speak to the heart, which means you have to bring it into normal language. Last week, we had an interesting question about rhyme, and the questioner mentioned that, like in Chile, there are all sorts of folk songs and so forth, and different genres and so forth. So at the same time as you look at the kind of level of language making it understandable, you also need to look at the genre, the type of text that you're translating, and bring it into an appropriate text for your work, right? So if you happen to go down the same rabbit hole as I have and spend years working on epistemology, you aren't going to translate this in the style of a folk song. It won't happen. And if you try to take epistemology and translate it as a folk song, it's not going to work. Or maybe I should try it, maybe, but it'll be hard. It's not the right, you've got a difference between, so you have to pick something that's going to actually be like a good match. Now that's kind of an extreme example and one that's probably never going to, unlikely to come up. But if you have something, say you have if you have a tantric text that's showing like a really powerful ideas. It's a very powerful text. And you want to get some idea of a rhythm into it. And so you do it in a rhythm that's kind of more like a, what do we say? More like a nursery rhyme. So that your tantric text ends up sounding like what we'd say in English, hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock. The hickory dickory dockany. It's just like, it won't work. So you have to get, because, and the reason why is because the rhythms are the words. So you have to be careful, because like in English, we have a lot of, joke verses that are written in a certain meter, like a limerick. There once was a man from Nantucket who kept all his gold in a bucket. His daughter named Nan fell in love with a man, and as for the bucket, she took it. So you've got this kind of rhythm, da 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 da. And so in English, if you translate your heavy, powerful tantric text into a rhythm that goes da 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 da, then everyone's going to start laughing, and it's not going to carry that power. So you've got to be careful about what you're doing. You have to see what is it that's making the Tibetan work the way it does. So you've got the meaning. You've also got the form of the text. You've got to try to figure out, how do you bring this form into your own language? So the Tibetan, like the Tibetan has its own particular rhythm of the 9-syllable lines or the 7-syllable lines, and it's very moving forward. So how do you recreate that in your own language? Understanding that, especially with Spanish and Portuguese, you've got a very, very different rhythm in your language. So how do you come up with or find what rhythms in your language create the same feeling or a similar feeling as the Tibetan? How do you get that out? So this is looking at all on a kind of bigger level. So getting to this point takes a while. It takes a lot of practice. You will do a lot of translations, especially in your first few years translating, that you'll go back and look at them. And at the time, you'll think they're great. I'm getting this. I've got the feeling. And you go back and you look at it 5 years later and you go, oh, no, really not. So it takes a long time. You've got to figure out what works. And part of that means, as I said yesterday, reading a good bit in your own language. What I did when I was beginning to really work with translation is I got an anthology of poetry that had English poetry from the 12th century all the way up to it was published in the 20th century. I had an old book, so it's things that went up to the 1960s and 70s. So, reading all of that. So you go through looking at all the different, so I went through looking at all the files for the English literature and thinking, well, how does each kind of compare to the different Tibetan styles? And then when you do that, then you start working with them. You do some terrible translations for a while. And then eventually, as you get practiced at, as you develop your craft, then you'll be able to kind of do things in your own language that will be able to kind of communicate that same feeling. So translating, so you've got a bunch of different levels of the translation. You've got the kind of micro level of picking words. These should be words that people know. There's no need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to Dharma vocabulary. There's no need to invent Dharma words for words that you already have in your common use in your language. So you need to use the words that people will know or speak to, generally, with a couple of exceptions. Then on the kind of the bigger level, you need to put it into, decent grammar that people can understand, but not being too strict to the grammar of the Tibetan or of the underlying Sanskrit, if you have an opportunity to look at if it was originally written in Sanskrit. And then you have to kind of think about, well, what is the feeling in Tibetan? And so in order to get that, bring that feeling, assuming that you're getting the feeling out of the Tibetan, then you have to figure out, how do I bring that feeling into Spanish and English? Actually, in terms of this, as I say, assuming that you're getting the feeling in the Tibetan, there are two things to point here. The first is that you have to have some experience more than just having read it and thought about it. You have to actually, if you're thinking about sutra things, you really do need to engage in contemplation to kind of get an idea. So it actually kind of makes sense to you more than just being something you heard that you can regurgitate. It has to be something you thought about. And if it's about practice, whether tantric or sutra based, mainly tantric based, then you need to actually have done a bit of the practice and have some sort of a little bit of a feeling for how it feels in the actual practice. So like if you're translating a text that's used in a Drupchen, then you want to know, well, what does it feel like to actually do the puja in Tibetan? So have that feeling. So you got to have that. That's the one thing. And when you do that, then when you look at other texts, you kind of get more of a feeling. The other aspect is that actually by working on the translation, that's a one way for us to do all of that work that I was just saying. You don't really have the feeling yet. You don't quite understand it. But you start trying to bring it into your own language. And as you bring it into your own, try bringing it into your own language, you find out what you don't know. If you are willing to admit that you don't know. So you have to be humble and look at what you don't know. Then you need to show it to people, and you need to look for the people who are going to give you honest and perhaps brutal feedback. And they will then help you see where the problems and what you've done is. And then as you do that, you actually get a feeling where you can, a point where you can actually sort of feel what's going on in the text. So this is kind of the sort of the looking at it all on sort of the positive way of how to build it up. So on the one hand, you have to do the education things as I spoke about last week. On the other hand, give it a try. Find some easy, some short thing, not necessarily easy. None of it's going to be easy at first. Once you get to a point where you've got a little bit of Tibetan, then give it a try. Take something short and try translating it. See, how can you do it? You've got this practice that you've done that you just really enjoy doing. Well, you want to do it in Portuguese. Excellent. So please translate it. How can you bring it into Portuguese so it's something you can actually recite it or sing it? If you can sing it, then people are going to feel more faith. So how can you do that? To try. And the more you try, and don't expect anything to come out good your first time, although it might be, you're going to try to do something good, but don't necessarily expect it, and do what you can and just keep going. And eventually that process will kind of inform what you're doing in terms of your education. So the two will work together, and it'll go better. So that is that's the area of looking at the language and sort of the style. So this is my own personal feeling. There are other translators who have different approaches, who look at it differently, and who probably under the influence of their teachers who very strongly encouraged them to do this. They try to be very literal to the Tibetan, and there's some value in that. There's some good translations that are written like that. My own personal feeling and the encouragement I've had from both the Karmapa and Trungpa Rinpoche has been to try to bring it into normal language, natural English as much as I can. And I try to do that with varying degrees of success. So that's that. Now, the next thing that I want to speak about this morning is if we look at, well, how do we know if our translations are good, or what are, and another way of asking about that, what are the problems that we can have in translation? And when you look at the problems you can have in translation, above putting aside ideas of style, which is sort of a different category that I just spoke about. So forgetting about style, basically the first idea is that you completely misunderstood it. You get it wrong. That's easy to see. Everyone can see that this is a mistake. The second mistake is that you leave something out. You miss a word, you skip a sentence, you just omit something. Now here you have to be a little bit careful, because sometimes there are things that are repeated in Tibetan that if you repeat them in English are redundant. It doesn't sound good. So there are points in English where there's where like the subject or like something is repeated in Tibetan and it sounds fine in Tibetan, but it sounds lame in English. And so there you might use a pronoun like it or whatever the second time around in order to make it into good English. That is not missing it. That's making a choice. If you just forget to put it in entirely, that's missing it, losing it. That's a second type of fault. And the third type of fault is adding things to the text, putting in things that were not originally in the text. So this is, in Tibetan, they will often talk about two types of faults, chepekyun and hlapekyun. Chepa means you missed it. Chlapa is like extra, right? So adding things. So these are generally they'll talk about these two types of faults, chepa and chlapa. And then I've added the third one that you just completely missed it, but you got it wrong, right? So everyone can see that just getting it wrong is obviously wrong. So we don't really need to speak about it that much. But among the chepekyun and the hlapekyun, which of these is actually a worse problem? And I think actually when I look at English translations, which may be different than in Spanish and Portuguese, when I look at English translations, the biggest fault is not the chepekyun. It's not that people are leaving things out. The biggest fault is that people are adding more. So this is something that we have to be very careful of. For example, the Tzadar Foundation sponsored and published the translations of the Shija Kunchapzu, which in Tibetan is 3 volumes and in English is 10, which tells you something already. So 3 volumes in English, 10 volumes in English. And there's one particular volume where there were like sentences of like 2 or 3 lines in 2 or 3 lines in Tibetan that were translated as entire paragraphs in English. So obviously this is an instant where the translator was the way I found out about this was that one of the person who was preparing the digital editions was doing a bilingual edition. He was looking at it. He had, like a sentence in English and a sentence in Tibetan and a paragraph in English. So this is something we have to think about. Why is this? Well, it's because the Tibetan was talking about grammatical ideas that based on Sanskrit grammar that no one understands in English. And so the translator, in order to make it understandable, included explanations as part of his translation. So he put them there. So he mixed Jangankoto Lodotai's ideas with his own explanations of those. In other words, he's not writing a commentary, or he's not doing a translation, he's writing a commentary on it. So these are different. You have to make sure that you're not writing commentaries in Spanish and Portuguese. You're doing a translation. A translation and a commentary are very different things. So this is a point where if it really needs to have explanation, which it probably does when you're talking about Sanskrit grammar, then you can use footnotes. That's the way to, if it absolutely needs to be explained. So that's kind of an extreme, but I think a more common thing that happens, and I've seen this in many different translations, is that there's one word in Tibetan and the translator feels like, oh, it's not quite this English word, it's not quite that, it's kind of both. And so they put in 2 words. You've got one idea in Tibetan that obviously, English and Tibetan, the terms have different semantic relationships. There are plenty of Tibetan words that can be translated as 5 or 6 different English words. So that's normal. So when you're translating, if you take that word and you translate that one word as as both, then you think, okay, I've got both levels of the meaning. Well, perhaps you do, but perhaps you're actually adding something. For example, if you're doing, like I was looking at a translation of a text on Madhyamaka, where you have to be extremely careful when you're looking at this. And there is a translation, it's a very well accepted and well-regarded translation of this text. And when you look at it, they have a lot of single words that were in the Tibetan that were translated as two different words in English. Now, partially they did this to make it read better. Partially they did it to get a better idea of what the sense is. The problem was that they're talking about Madhyamaka. They're talking about the middle way. And you have to be incredibly precise when you're talking about philosophy, because they actually used words that ended up in a very subtle way that they probably didn't think about, contradicting what they're saying. They ended up contradicting their own logic in a very subtle way that you wouldn't think about if you haven't been through Shedra or had a lot of philosophical study. You'd think, oh, it sounds nice. Well, when you start looking at it and you think about the actual implications of what they're saying, and you say, on a very subtle level, they're actually contradicting the problem. So this is a problem, right? So you should look at trying to find a way to find the word that works best. So you should resist the urge to take, one thing and translate it into a long sentence, in a whole long thing, when it's actually very simple. I think if you're especially in English, because of the way English style is, we prefer concise and clear and direct sentences in English. So if you can bring it into really concise, clear English, it's going to be more stylistically better. It's also going to be more accurate for the translation, assuming you pick the right word. So you have to be very careful. When you might find places where you are adding words, and you have to go and you have to think, well, are you really doing this for a good reason? Is there something? Now, sometimes there are Tibetan words that you just can't translate in short form in English. Like there's the word panglang. Pangwa means to give up. Langwa means to do. And what it means in English, to say it the most idiomatic way we can, is to don't do the things you should do, don't do the things you should not do, and do the things you should. Behave properly. So how do you translate this into English that people are going to understand? If you say to reject and accept, which some people translate, and I have used that term before, no one's going to understand what you're talking about. So that's an instance where you have to, in order to communicate the idea, you have to say more. But there are times when it goes the other way around. Like when you have, and this comes up frequently in tantric texts or the discussions of pure realms, you have the ground that is nena nimshin tekna par. So nena nimshin, you push it down, it goes down, and you lift it up and it comes back up. And so you see translations where people translate this very literally. The ground depresses when you step on it and it rises back up when you're done. Well, in English, we have a very easy way to say this. It is soft and springy. This is an easy English idiom. And so you can take that long, nana nimjin takna par, and just go in English easily, soft and springy. So you've got to be kind of on the lookout for these things that are communicating in a lot of words in Tibetan, something that goes in a few words in your language. So when I'm doing a written translation, I often look at the word count as kind of a gauge to tell me, how close am I or not? So you get a word count of the original Tibetan. Now, when you do the word count of the original Tibetan, it's going to give you a count of the number of syllables, not the number of so-called words, because the idea of a word is a little bit different in Tibetan anyways. And in English, you're going to count the whole words, but in English and also in Spanish and Portuguese, probably more so in Spanish and Portuguese, you have all the articles and prepositions, right? What I take as a good rule of thumb is that if I have more words in English than I did in the original, then I have added something. Actually, what I find after I work through translation and try to get it done, I find that actually the English word count should be somewhere between like maybe 85 to 90% of the Tibetan word count, given that Tibetan is counting syllables, but Tibetan has fewer articles, it has fewer prepositions, or it's just a different language. But if you go, I use that as a general rule of thumb. So Spanish and Portuguese, you've got more extra words than we do in English. And I'm saying extra words. They're totally necessary words. You have to put them in. You have to use them, right? So when you look at it, you might think about, can you get a roughly equal number of Tibetan word number and Portuguese or Spanish? If you're roughly equal, then you're doing okay. So that's kind of like my guideline to say, have I gone overboard with the words? Am I adding too much? That's just a really rough and stupid way of looking at it. Of course, other languages would have different measures. I mean, Chinese would probably go down to even fewer, like maybe, I don't know, 50 or 60% word count compared to Tibetan, because just the way the written Chinese language works. So you have to kind of know what your own language is. So most of you are thinking about Portuguese and Spanish. You've got a language that just uses more words. And when you use those words, then you use them expressively. There's a reason why you use that, why you have all these extra words in Spanish and Portuguese. It allows you to do things that you can't do in Tibetan. And so you should feel free to use the tools that your language gives you to do something that's going to help the people who speak your language, then read the texts and gain some feeling. And what do we say? Be able to really get some benefit out of those texts. So I think those are the main points that I wanted to speak about today. And perhaps some of you have some questions or anything, any ideas or questions.
I do have one question, David.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So for instance, when translating, how can I say, like poetry, verses, actually verses.
Yes.
So,
oh, yeah.
Because I'm working in translation with verses. And
oh, yeah.
So I don't know the Tibetan very well. So I got one verse that has already the translation in English, right? So I can translate Portuguese.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when I'm going to translate, I see that the verses, they are mixed. When I go to see, the first sentence means Cherenzi, and then when I go to the second one, then the translation appears Cherenzi. It's not, the verses is twisted. Can I say that?
Yes.
Do you understand by that?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
So I was wondering, what do you think about this? I mean, when translating verses, shall I keep the meaning, in the verse, or is it okay to twist? Or I would like to know.
Yeah.
What do you think about it?
Okay. So the myth is that when the Tibetans translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan, they translated everything exactly the same in Tibetan, but in Sanskrit. When you compare the Tibetan translations to the Sanskrit originals, what you find is that the Tibetans changed the order of the words to make it match the Tibetan order. It changed the order of the lines in order that they could say the idea in proper Tibetan. They sometimes added lines, not very frequently, but you find places where they added lines because they needed one more line of Tibetan than they had in Sanskrit. There are times when the Tibetans would leave one line out. So they would take a complete shloka, which is like 4 pada or 4 lines, and translate it into 3 in Tibetan. So when we look at what, so we have this idea that the Tibetan that we're starting from is some sort of like, this is it, right? And that it has to be like that. Well, you can't do that. The Tibetan translators themselves did not do that. So what we need to do when we bring it into our own languages is you need to put it in the order that makes sense in your language, that is expressive in your language, that has good grammar, or when you're doing poetry, bends the grammar in ways that are appropriate. And change the number of change the order of the lines, to have different numbers of lines if necessary, and that this is all perfectly okay. It's not only okay, it's better. So you've got to take it and put it into what's going to work in your language. I probably should have mentioned this, but it's not like it's, you've got this iron cage that you have to fit it in. So when you take, now, if you're translating from English, that is, and taking English and going into Portuguese, then you've got another issue, which is that you've got the English language in between, and it often depends on sort of the skill of the translator and the style of the translator, what they do. I mean, some translators, like with the songs of Milarepa, some of the translators, it sounds like an American country song. Some of the translators, it sounds like an American Broadway song. So, different translators have their own different styles. So you have to be aware of that, because Milarepa's style was a little bit different. And you have to look at, how are they doing it? So if you're just beginning your Tibetan, you should still try to get the Tibetan issue and compare the English and the Tibetan to get an idea of where they took it from. Even better if it's coming from if it's like something that comes from ancient Sanskrit and you're really crazy about this sort of thing, you can try to compare the Sanskrit and so forth. That's how I've learned what little Sanskrit I do. Is I never studied it. I just sort of compared, and you pick things up. A little bit of study, but anyways, so you just look and you compare and you say, well, how do I make this work in Portuguese as Portuguese so that someone can read it and say, this doesn't sound like some funky translation, The other point is that when English translators started translating, particularly the devotional and practice literature, their idea was that they were translating something to help other people who were reciting in Tibetan understand the Tibetan. So they were not translating in a way that people would recite it in English. They had no intent that people would recite it in English. And so they often didn't put a lot of interest into the style. They didn't care. Or of course, they do care to a certain degree. They want it to be nice English, but they didn't really worry about, is it poetic or not? So when you're starting going from the English translation and going into Portuguese, then you have to think about, well, who translated it? What were they translating it for? The English. And so what do you want in Portuguese? Are you working in a center where you have a Lama who says that everyone's doing everything in Tibetan? And then, maybe it's less important to get it into like really poetic Portuguese. Or are you thinking about if you're doing it for someone like, Mingyur Rinpoche talks about having people recite things in their own language. You go to a teaching with Mingyur Rinpoche, he says, recite it twice in Tibetan, then the third time, everyone recite it in your own language. And so then you're going to have a mishmash. So you want the people who are reading it in Portuguese to say, wow, that feels like something. Right. So that's what so it depends a little bit on what your aim is, who you're translating, what you're doing. There are a lot of issues that go into it. And another issue that goes into it is the sort of level of difficulty and the amount of time that it's going to take you to do it. As a beginner, it's good to put the time in and try to do as best you can, because that's how you get better. Okay. Any more questions?
Khenpo?
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference? For me, there's a very thin line between translating the meaning and adding my comment. What's the difference? Because if I try to translate the meaning, maybe just adding what I understand about the thing?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Yeah, yeah. To a certain degree, you do have to think, do people know? Like the one that I mentioned is kind of a good example of this, the idea of panglong in Tibetan, that in English is like not doing wrong and doing good, or the do's. Actually, in English, you could say the do's and don'ts if you want to be really, don't do this, don't do this, you know. But that's not always going to work in a Dharma context. So you have to think about, is it necessary to really say that so people understand? So when we're talking about adding things, there are a couple of different things that we have to add going from Tibetan into Indo-European languages. And the first are things that we have to add, or things that we need to add for grammar. Okay, so articles, all that, that's easy. You just use it because you have to use it to make your language work. And if you don't put them in, then people are going to complain. They're not going to understand. The second is where there is something that is, what do you say, implicit in the Tibetan that is not in in your target language. For example, if you are translating a story from the life of Milarepa, you will see that they very rarely say who is saying anything or who is doing anything. Most of the sentences do not have an explicit subject. And so you will have to, in order to make it understandable in Portuguese, you will have to say Milarepa or the Jetsun or whatever, then said. And then you will have to say Sangye Kyap said, did this, or Rechungpa did this. And you will have to put in those names because otherwise it's not going to be, you'll look at it and it'll be, if you do it without the names, it said, the sentence went to Chuar, sat in the cave, meditated. And it's going to make no sense in your language, right? So you have to add the, Milarepa went to Chuar, he found a good cave, he sat and meditated. You have to add the subject of the sentence. So that is not the sort of adding that I'm talking about. Those are addings that you need to do because it's just the nature of it. So when you have something that especially when you get to technical terms, there are a lot of things that are very that just don't make sense if you use a single word, or you can't express it in a single word in English or in Portuguese, or where people aren't going to know. So those are places where you can add a little bit, but you have to be reasonable about it. You can't add too much. That's another level. Another area, a very subtle area of adding, is in terminology, because I spoke at the beginning about how the Tibetans took, every prefix in Sanskrit and translated as a separate word in Tibetan. What happens in a lot of English translations is that they then take them and translate each of those Tibetan equivalents of a Sanskrit prefix, they translate it into English as a separate word. And then if you compare that to the original, like you've got moksha and vimoksha, and they're actually not really particularly different in Sanskrit. They're basically the same thing. Just a slight difference in feeling. And if you say freedom and complete freedom in English, there's like a huge difference between the two. So that's another way of adding things. So it's a very difficult. So what you have to do is you have to work through it and see how little can you put in to make it understandable. If something absolutely has to be put in, is there another way to do it, such as a footnote, if it is appropriate in the style of text that you're translating? If you're translating a book, then footnotes are fine. If you're translating a prayer that people are going to recite in a Dharma center, footnotes are awkward. They're not going to work. So you got to sort of figure out what's going to work in the thing that you're looking in the text, and you just have to try it. And, kind of be critical of yourself and say, is this working? Am I putting in too much or not? And just do it as experience. Okay.
Thank you.
So I think, so.
Can I ask you, Khenpo?
Yes, please.
I would like to hear your opinion about this idea that popped up in my mind. When you were talking about sin, for instance, we should be careful to the translations that we do. For instance, if I translate this as good karma or bad karma, for instance, I think that even though someone who has this anti-religious preconception, he or she will have like rejection to this kind of word. So I think that at the end it's out of merit if someone is interested in the text, or in even if he or she understands the meaning. What do you think about this?
Yes, I think this is actually a very good point. So, because some people just don't have the merit to understand it, no matter how you express it. So, if we go back to the word I used, the Tibetan word dikpa. So, one particularly old style translation would be to translate this in English as sin. Now, other people think, okay, this word, you can't use the word sin, because actually what happens is if you say the word sin, then people who are kind of interested automatically run away. They just run away. I mean, it doesn't fly. I mean, I tried it. It didn't work. If you're in an oral translation, you can see immediately what happens when you say that word. So some people find this problem. So what they do is they use the English word negativity. Well, okay. Now, negativity, yeah, that makes it doesn't make anyone run away. Everyone feels fine about it. Is killing negativity? I mean, yeah, I accumulated negativity by killing someone. But negativity, you have to be, that's someone who's going a little bit too far. Because when you actually think about what negativity means in English is when you walk into a room and everyone is kind of looking at you like, who's that? That's what we mean by negativity in English, right? So if you say killing is negativity, it's like, wow, bad trip, bummer. You can't say that. It doesn't communicate the meaning, right? So you need to have something that's going to sound bad. So what I use for the word is I say misdeed. Because, misdeeds, it's an older English word. It's not as idiomatic. People don't use it as much these days. But it says, this is something you did that was bad. So it's looking for the right level of language. So you've got a word like sin that people are going to run away from, or the other, or or get the wrong idea from. You've got some sort of new agey sort of translation for this that people are going to just say, "Wow, bummer," and then they're going to go out and do what they want. They're not going to worry about their. If you call misdeeds negativities, what are people going to do? They're not going to take their vows too seriously. They're not even going to take the 5 precepts. They're not going to engage in good conduct and all that. They're not going to get an idea that it's really bad. It's just like, yeah, bummer. That's not, killing is more than just negativity. It's like, it's a misdeed. It's a wrong action that you've done. So you've got to find something that communicates that without making people run away. But there are people, when you're talking about this word, there are people who have especially in America, who have from the 1970s thought that following your own bliss and doing what you want is the best thing and the highest thing in life, and just don't want to hear about anything at all. And they're going to never come back once the moment you say misdeed. They might listen to teaching where someone says negativity, but I don't know they're going to get much out of it because, as you said, they haven't got the merit. So I think this is this is about the time that we have for this today. So thank you very much for joining me. Now, I think actually I've kind of covered most of the main points that I think are important to cover in an introductory talk. So I think maybe what we ought to do is, if we do something next week, maybe I should speak with Drupchen and we can discuss what to do. Maybe we could do something more like a question and answer, a little bit more like that next week, rather than me giving a particular talk. Does that sound?
Great. Yeah, that sounds very nice.
Okay. So we've had a lot to think about over the last 3 weeks. So thank you very much. So let's close by dedicating the merit of thinking about and discussing translation to the benefit of all translation, to the benefit of all sentient beings, so that they can all understand the Dharma in their own language and quickly reach Buddhahood. Osanam de tanje sibani tobnen ye beranam pamchete gegana chibalong chobai sibe toledro kunyorosho. And now in our own languages. So you all recite in Portuguese and Spanish. I'll do it in English. Sanam, that's not English. By this merit may we attain omniscience, defeat the enemy, wrongdoing, and free all wanderers from the ocean of existence, churned by great waves of birth, age, sickness, and death. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You can
Yeah.
follow.
Thank you. Bye-bye.